2018年3月22日，时任美国总统川普签署备忘录，指控中国对美国智慧财产权及商业秘密的保护不足，并依据1974年贸易法第301条，授权美国贸易代表对部分自中国进口的商品征收关税。此举标志着一场影响全球供应链与经济格局的美中贸易摩擦正式展开。即使在拜登政府期间，双方在部分领域尝试对话与协调，但整体对峙态势仍未有显著缓和的迹象。随着川普于2025年再度就任美国总统，并在4月宣布关税政策升级，这场贸易摩擦进入一个更加复杂与高风险的阶段。最初面对这场美中贸易摩擦，中方技术官僚以谈判为主要策略，试图透过增加美国农产品及民用航空采购，来调整经贸利益流向以进行缓解。然而，随着摩擦延续至今，中方策略已明显调整，反映出对长期对抗及经济韧性的全面考量。
That was out of the blue, right? Out of the blue, they came up with this whole import-export concept, and nobody knew anything about it.
President Trump seemingly reignited the U.S.-China trade war after threatening China with a 100% tariff. That's on top of the 30% tariff that's already in effect. Trump made the announcement on Friday in response to Beijing tightening up its rules for rare earth exports needed to produce several electronics. Financial markets showed major signs of concern following those comments.
Last week on Friday, President Trump unveiled plans to impose an additional 100% tariff on all Chinese exports to the United States. He also announced fresh restrictions on the export of any and all critical software beginning November 1st, 9 days before the current tariff relief is set to expire.
Based on the fact that China has taken this unprecedented position and speaking only for the USA and not other nations who were similarly threatened, starting November 1st, 2025 United States of America will impose a tariff of 100% on China over and above any tariff that they are currently paying. Also on November 1st, we will impose export controls on any and all critical software.
Trump's measures come after China's decision to expand export curbs on rare earth elements, which are key materials used in advanced technologies including smartphones, electric vehicles, and military systems. Describing China's actions as a hostile order, President Trump said the United States had been left with no choice but to respond financially. The president also hinted at possible new restrictions on U.S. airplane parts and technology exports to China, though no formal announcement has in fact been made.
For every element that they have been able to monopolize, we have two. I never thought it would come to this, but perhaps, as with all things, the time has come. Ultimately, though potentially painful, it will be a very good thing in the end for the USA.
He warned that China was attempting to hold the world captive and hinted at a massive increase of tariffs on Chinese goods, an additional 100% tariffs. Then, in retaliation, China's Commerce Ministry responded to the threat, urging Washington to promptly correct its wrong practices and engage in equal-footed consultation. The statement said, and I quote from it, we do not want a tariff war, but we are not afraid of one. The ministry warned that if the US insists on going the wrong way, China would take resolute measures to protect its legitimate interests. On the export controls, it said that it was not an export ban, emphasizing that the licenses would be issued for civilian and humanitarian uses. Now, the center of all of this fuss is rare earth elements.
But based on the response that we're seeing out of the Chinese, it seems as though the Chinese do not intend to back down or change their stance on their rare earths curbs. I think it potentially could mean that they believe that this is a good way to add leverage in these discussions to be able to get more concessions. And from the Chinese perspective, it would be seen that the ball is now in President Trump's court. So if he doesn't respond, that could mean that we wouldn't necessarily see any more escalation. Of course, if he does respond, then we would see an escalation, at least from the Chinese have been pledging that.
I mean, it really depends on who's in a better position for whether the moves made on each side. And, obviously China doing okay, but this is going to take us a large bite out of manufacturing. In fact, people are calling it de facto an embargo of China, who's going to do business with China. So we'll see how long they can do this. And, we were talking on Friday, this was the rare metal move was someone called it the economic equivalent of nuclear war.
The U.S. stocks suffered their worst sell-off in 6 months. The S&P 500 wiped out its weekly advance after tumbling 2.7%. That is its worst day since April 10th, when the tariff-induced sell-off rattled financial markets.
What I do want to highlight, though, is this is the first big sort of visceral reaction we've seen from investors in months when it comes to tariffs. And it's for 3 reasons, Mugo. One, everyone remembers that Trump 1.0, the trade war, that yes, there were moments where it looked like Beijing and the U.S. were going to make a deal, but it actually took over 2 years. So I think investors were going, oh gosh, I have PTSD from that. It's Groundhog Day. This is the second time around. Yeah. And then the other part of it is that if you have a 130% tariff that goes into effect on November 1st, because remember, we've got that 30% tariff and it would be 100% on top of it. Let's think about what the Fed is going to do at the end of October when they meet. They don't have the data that we've talked about before because of the government shutdown, and then they have the prospect of this looming tariff. You could see them say, I'm just going to wait and see. I'm going to pause on making any interest rate moves. And that's also why you saw that visceral reaction in the market on Friday, because investors want interest rate cuts. Now, like I said, we're seeing that rebound today, but I think it really does speak to China and the tariffs. This is really that thing that can move the market that investors get concerned about.
一开始，美中贸易对抗走在典型的算盘对决路线，双方着眼的都是数字、关税清单、出口额、GDP 损失、就业率波动。但当华府的对华鹰派成功将华为威胁包装成国家安全议题后，这场冲突就不再只是单纯的贸易纠纷，而是涵盖范围更广的供应链保卫战。2019年，美国商务部将华为列入实体清单，标志着技术竞争正式取代贸易谈判。自此后，全球半导体产业链重组，电子设备成本上升。国际货币基金 IMF 估算，光是供应链中断对全球制造业的生产力就造成约 0.8% 的年度损失。如今进入2025年，这场算盘之争更是演变成制度性的对抗。在美国，鹰派官员主张以极限施压迫使中国让步，而在北京，对美强硬派则将贸易战定义为国运之战。两边的逻辑惊人的相似，都相信痛苦是必要的测试，都把短期的经济代价视为长期战略自立的代价。
Uneasiness lingering over the trade stance between U.S. and China. President Donald Trump declaring America is back in a trade war with China.
Mr. President, you're meeting with President Xi in a few weeks.
Yeah.
If you can't come to an agreement or a deal at that meeting, are we in for a sustained trade war with China?
Well, you're in one now. Look, we have 100% tariff. If we didn't have tariffs, we would be exposed as being a nothing. We would have no defense.
Now, for The View from Beijing, here's a quick glance at Chinese media. An article on Xi Jinping's economic thought strikes an assertive tone on trade tensions with the United States. It frames the tariff spat as among the tough battles and protracted wars China must endure to make the economy stronger. It says China will fight to the end and quotes Xi Jinping's call for party members to, quote, enhance the sense of crisis, carry forward the spirit of struggle, and improve the ability to fight.
Just glancing at the Global Times this morning, well, the take there is that the U.S. should not be surprised by moves out of China. An editorial, they're blaming Washington for this recent escalation, pointing to this series of restrictions and tariff threats after those talks, of course, in Madrid. Now, it says the U.S. overestimated its leverage while, quote, underestimating China's capacity for counteraction and its strategic composure.
But I think it's really interesting. The U.S. has really had its own way in terms of sanctioning other countries for several decades. And so we've become more and more used to reaching for that tool or that instrument in our kind of political toolbox when we want to deal with other countries, particularly, countries that we're not pleased with. And so I think what we're dealing with today is something quite different, which is for the first time, really, the U.S. is on the receiving end of being sanctioned and is not really prepared for it and doesn't like it. And so responds, kind of impetuously, as we saw over the last couple of days.
Next, the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has described China's major expansion of its rare earths export controls as a complete repudiation of U.S.-Chinese trade agreements over the past 6 months. Greer told a news conference that China's export restrictions were a global supply chain power grab, and the U.S. and its allies would not accept the restrictions. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent slammed Beijing's rare earth export curbs. He says it's now China versus the world, vowing that Washington and its allies would neither be commanded nor controlled.
It's the latest episode in the tit-for-tat tariff saga between the world's two largest economies. At the heart of the renewed trade tensions, China's latest export controls on rare earth materials.
And make no mistake, this is China versus the world. They have put these unacceptable export controls on the entire world. China is a command and control economy, and we and our allies will neither be commanded nor controlled.
Well, Angela, the Treasury Secretary and the President seem to be engaged in this good cop, bad cop routine, which is not uncommon for the Trump administration. We often see this ahead of talks. There is this pressure campaign, really the Trump administration setting up that stack of bargaining chips, laying out what they want, but also what will happen if they don't get their way. Scott Bessent dangling this carrot in front of China, suggesting that Washington might extend that 90-day pause on tariffs. It's currently due to run out around the beginning of November, and they could do that, but only if China halts its export controls on their rare earths.
Now, moments ago, President Trump posted this, quote, "I believe that China purposely not buying our soybeans and causing difficulty for our soybean farmers is an economically hostile act. We are considering terminating business with China having to do with cooking oil and other elements of trade as retribution. As an example, we can easily produce cooking oil ourselves. We don't need to purchase it from China." All right, so let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady to break this all down. Okay, first, how do soybeans factor into the U.S.-China trade relationship? And then also talk to us about this latest threat now from the president, and could it complicate things?
So soybeans are really important when it comes to our agricultural sector. For many soybean farmers, I actually went out to a number of different places in the Midwest and talked to them. That is their primary market. And if you go back to the first China trade war under the first Trump administration, you saw soybeans become a piece of leverage that China stopped buying them. And then ultimately the deal that was actually put together that ended the trade war saw China upping its purchase of soybeans. And so when we talked to soybean farmers earlier in the year, this was something that they were predicting, that this could become an element of leverage in this negotiation. And so that's really the piece of it, how it factors in. China's a really important market in terms of selling those goods for U.S. farmers. Could this become, an issue here when it comes to the cooking oil? I think broadly, it's a small piece of it, right? In terms of that larger U.S.-China trade relationship, but it speaks to the fact that we are seeing just this constant back and forth. I mean, Jules, it feels like hourly we are hearing either from the China side or the U.S. side. And I will share with you, I was on the Chinese Embassy X account, and this is what they said earlier today. The U.S. side should not, on the one hand, seek dialogue, while on the other hand, threaten and intimidate by introducing new restrictive measures. This is not the right way in dealing with China. So yeah, Jules, we're talking about soybeans and cooking oil on the one hand. Really, though, what we are talking about is an escalating trade war, and it does feel like it's developing minute by minute here.
这场美中对抗其实早已跨越关税这条界限。自2019年起，对华鹰派将华为议题纳入国家安全框架，使冲突正式进入制度与供应链的深水区。从那一刻起，北京开始系统性的制定应对策略，准备面对长期且结构性的竞争。到了2025年，这场对抗的外溢效应早已超越双边关系，演变成全球性的痛苦阈值测试。中国新一轮稀土出口管制规定，即使产品中仅含0.1%的中国稀土，也必须申请出口许可。这项政策被视为史上最严格的资源控管，导致原料价格显著上涨。国际货币基金警告，如果贸易紧张持续升温，供应链断裂，全球产出可能下滑0.3个百分点，并引发金融市场的无序修正。这不单纯是两国之间的竞争，更是一场波及全球的制度性震荡。当华府与北京的强硬派都将痛苦测试视为必经之路时，真正承受压力的是夹在供应链中的企业、国家以及消费者。对世界而言，问题已不再是站哪一边，而是如何在这场制度对抗里保持韧性，不被迫成为棋局里的代价。
From your perspective as an academic and also an advisor to those in the foreign ministry, do you feel one side might be building or overplaying their hand too much or building too much reliance on their leverage?
So if you follow the developments, it has been the U.S. who has been keep pushing China, building pressure on China, overplay its card on China, weaponize the interdependence between two countries. So finally, it forced China to fight back, to retaliate. So back to September 19th, when President Xi and President Trump had a phone conversation, basically, I think that conversation was quite constructive. But only 10 days later, the U.S., Commerce, the BIS, come up with a new rule, 50% rule, which actually will put thousands of more Chinese enterprises on the entity list. So there's a huge impact, not only on the Chinese enterprises, on Chinese economy, but more importantly, it raises the issue on the Chinese side whether the U.S. is serious about, forging some consensus in the forthcoming summit and step by step to improve trade relations with China, or the U.S. side, within the Trump administration, was simply divided, with some pragmatists who wanted to improve relations with China, but then you have the hawkish people, they never want to, have a normal relation with China.
Professor Wu, let me just play the devil's advocate a little bit here and ask your opinion on whether you feel that the Chinese government might be overplaying its hand a little bit right now? That's something that's come out of Washington, that essentially they thought they had some sort of agreement on the relaxation of the export curbs on rare earth metals and magnets. And then China now has taken a much more assertive position in between the rounds of trade talks by talking about more strict control. Granted, China's trying to gain some leverage ahead of the next round of talks, ahead of any kind of summit. But are they potentially overplaying their hand in an assertive way that could also make other nations outside of the United States more angry and disrupt supply chains? We're seeing the G7 finance ministers meeting in Washington, D.C., where they're going to be talking about their own reaction to China's actions on rare earths.
Well, 2 points. First, over whether this is overplayed or not. Well, that depends on whether China can, effectively force the U.S. to scale back again. Is September 29th BIS new rule. So anything that can get the U.S. to cancel this latest pressure on China will be necessary. So that's point one. Point two, regarding broader ramifications of China's recent export control policy, I think most countries know this is not particularly targeted on them. It is mainly a retaliation to the U.S. moves on China. So if these countries, they handle relations with China, especially trade and economic relations with China well, without assisting the U.S. in sanctioning China, in pursuing the export control of China, I think, they don't have to worry about this. So basically, this actually gives China more leverage in making sure other U.S. allies will not jump aboard to help the U.S. in pressuring China. I think China knows how to play the card wisely.